Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good dark topic, let's do it. What's one of the most horrifying deaths you've ever heard of? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Most of the ones that really chill me have already been covered, but no one has yet mentioned Vladimir Komarov, the man who fell from space, first cosmonaut ever to go up twice. It became increasingly apparent during planning and training for his second mission, Soyuz 1, that it was terribly flawed at every level, but all official protests fell on deaf ears because of the bureaucratic culture of the program and the Kremlin. The whole thing had an air of doom, but he knew if he backed out, apart from all other consequences, his close friend and Soviet hero, Yuri Gagarin, would be compelled to take his place. The launch was a success, but after achieving orbit, the solar sail failed to properly deploy, leaving several crucial systems unpowered and obscuring transmission from communications and navigation equipment. He wrestled with the craft, trying to get it manually oriented for 5 hours, and, through skillful piloting, partially succeeded, but failing thrusters and bad weather conditions caused mission control to scuttle a companion launch that was intended to aid him and to abort his mission. He had to stay up, orbiting Earth 18 times without proper guidance systems, acting as a human computer and gyroscope to get it into a proper re-entry window despite the unresponsive thrusters. But he eventually succeeded. He was in radio contact with Gagarin, assuring him conditions were good. It looked like he may actually make it. And then the primary chute failed to deploy. And then the secondary chute got tangled in the primary chute. Then the retro rockets failed to fire on ground approach, which would have been right before he hit the Earth at 90 miles an hour. Some reports have him transmitting screams of rage on the way down. In a similar vein, I was literally nauseous with horror when I first found out that NASA covered up the fact that the Challenger accident wasn't immediately fatal, and that several of the astronauts were likely alive and conscious as their capsule rocketed off and then plunged into the sea. My friend's fiance was an underwater welder, diving so deep it was like being in total darkness. One day he went down and never resurfaced. I can't remember if it was due to a rupture or shock, but imagining him dying in such a dark, eerie place haunts me. Kyle McGarity pushed down a manhole and was boiled alive over several hours. He had no broken bones or blunt force trauma, and steam doesn't kill nerve endings, so he felt the whole thing until it killed him. I've seen one where you slowly die over time, my father's Alzheimer's. I watched him turn into a shadow of himself from the brightest and kindest man I knew. Those Trinidadian divers that got sucked into that pipe they were working on, one of them was able to escape and go for help, but the company or government stalled the efforts, and the other two ended up suffocating a few days later in that dark, cold pipe underwater. I think it's ALS/MMND, a terminal illness which I sadly have. You slowly lose control over every muscle in your body. You can't do anything for yourself. Eventually, you lose the ability to swallow and have to be fed through a tube. Then your lungs get too weak to breathe, and you have to be on a ventilator. All of this while your mind is unaffected, basically being locked in your own body. My mother drowned when her car was swept into floodwaters. She was seatbelted in, and due to the infirmities, would not have been able to get herself out. I imagine her last moments were terrifying, and it took almost 3 days to recover her body. I saw something the other day about a woman who was doing research in the ocean and got dragged 300 feet underwater by a leopard seal that grabbed her by the foot. They resurfaced 10 minutes later. I believe it's the only recorded leopard seal attack resulting in death. Hopefully she passed out quickly. That's just so terrifying to me. I'm a semi-retired oil geologist and certified master blaster. For the past 5 or so years, my teams and I have volunteered our time and talents in closing abandoned mines. Not just closing these death traps, but also doing rescues and recoveries. I closed these death traps permanently with dynamite, C4, RDX, Petin, and my special homebrew nitroglycerin. In the last 5 or so years, my teams and I have rescued over 120 people who thought it'd be a good idea to wander into these murder holes and see what great riches they could grab. Here's a newsflash for anyone entertaining the idiot desire to go into these dangerous killer holes. They are abandoned for a reason. The simple reason? There's nothing in there of any value. It's all been removed by the owners. And they walked from a dangerous pit, usually out in the middle of absolute nowhere. My teams and I have also recovered 173 bodies in the same time period. Abandoned mines are a Disneyland of death and dismemberment. Bad air, i.e. CO, CO2, H2S, CH4, etc. Bad water, lethal molds, viri from animal dens, attacks from larger megafauna that have set up housekeeping in these holes in the ground, feet-thick layers of bat guano, hantavirus, rotted wood, false floors, abject darkness, pits, adits, tunnels, raises, and winzes that people march blindly into and find themselves falling for a few hundred feet. Over the last couple of months, I've rescued 3 family members, mother and daughters, who thought mine were great for a family walkabout. I also recovered the 2 dead from the same family, father and son, that blindly tumbled down into a shaft over 800 feet deep. More recently, I recovered a 10-year-old's body from a mine used by the local kids as a hangout. He had Down syndrome and had wandered away from his home over to the mine where he used to hang with his buddies. I recovered his body from under a pile of breakdown, which he triggered only to land on a ledge 300 feet below the main mine tunnel. The fall must have been terrifying, only to land at 32 feet per second squared on a narrow ledge of rocks that partially blocked the shaft. Unfortunately, the rocks he disturbed on the way down landed on him, crushing him to death. Plus, as a bonus, the rocks that fell to the bottom of the shaft hit old, stagnant water and caused clouds of nauseous gases to evolve rapidly to fill the shaft. My team and I had to go full P4 containment suits to recover the poor lad. That mine no longer exists. DuPont Herculean 70% extra fast, a few kilos of C4 and a gallon of nitro closed that worthless pit for perpetuity. Unfortunately, there are thousands upon thousands of these potential murder holes left existing in all western U.S. states. It's a job I'd gladly quit, but between people's greed and ignorance, I doubt I'll ever be out of work. There's really great insight from industry experts and personal stories of their own family members. So I think you guys touched on a lot of heavy stuff, and this is a heavy topic. So thank you all for sharing, and feel free to comment below your own experiences and thoughts. Kid in Ohio, I think that got stuck upside down in the back of his car. He slowly asphyxiated, and police even did a drive-by and didn't detect anything and left. Deborah Stevens, the woman was in her car while on the phone with 911, and she ended up drowning. The 911 operator told her to shut up. The 911 is awful to hear. Lamara Bell 2015 on the M9 near Stirling, Scotland. A car driven by her boyfriend crashed off the freeway. He died right away, but she was left in the car for 3 days with serious injuries. The crash was reported to police but never logged, so no one went to investigate. She was just left hanging there till a passerby went to investigate and found her. She died 4 days later in the hospital, but could have lived if the police hadn't effed up. Byford Dolphin accident. Divers were kept pressurized for weeks to avoid the bends so they could go down to the ocean floor without having to spend days coming back up. Basically, they lived in a pressurized pod. And when they had to dive, a diving bell was attached to the pod. It was pressurized, and the divers entered it before being sent to the floor. Upon return, they entered their pod again. It was sealed, and the diving bell was depressurized. Because the safety device wasn't installed, workers accidentally left a 5-inch gap between the pod and the bell when depressurizing the bell. Because of this, upon depressurizing the bell, the pod also depressurized, and the guy that was standing near that gap was forced through it due to the high pressure. It was over in an instant for him. But go look at the pictures of the aftermath, and you'll see why it's so horrifying. He was turned into a slab of meat. As a nurse, I'd much rather go through any one of these acutely terrible but relatively quick deaths than the protracted courses so many families will put a person through just because they can't let go. Imagine spending weeks, months, or years sometimes at a body in a bed, can't control your bowels or bladder, developing pressure wounds, your brain and body don't even know each other anymore. Sometimes you can't breathe and they'll force you by cutting a hole in your neck and putting in a trach. Sometimes you can't swallow or eat, so they poke a hole in your stomach through your skin and put a tube in there so they can feed you liquid nutrition and crush your meds to put in there. And because we've gotten good at this, we can torture a body for a very long time until it finally gives out. It's so inhumane and undignified. Everyone who has decision-making power over another person should have to spend some time looking at what people go through. They need to understand that prolonging life isn't the same as forcing someone to submit to a dragged-out death. In 2022, the guy I went to high school with got a new job at Caterpillar's foundry. It's his second week on the job, and he was tasked with taking a sample of the 2600-degree molten iron. Safety procedures weren't provided. There was literally no guardrail, and he fell into the crevice of molten iron. Coroner titled his death thermal annihilation. He literally disintegrated. That was the second death at that facility within 6 months. There's recently been another death from a guy getting molten iron sprayed on him. For the guy I know, Caterpillar was given a wrist slap fine of a mere $145,027 by OSHA, despite their revenue being more than $50 billion in 2011. Kellyanne Bates. Her much older boyfriend groomed her and ended up isolating her from her family. He called the police one day to say he accidentally killed his girlfriend and she drowned. When the police arrived, she was dead in the tub, but she was covered in varying stages of healed bruises. I believe her knees were broken, and he had gouged her eyes out. It was determined by the medical examiner that the eyes were done no less than 5 days before her death, but no more than 2 weeks. But either way, it happened while she was alive. On top of her eyes being gouged out, her eye sockets were also stabbed with a knife. Truly a horrific case. Hajna de Kaplani in San Jose, California, 1962. She was a stunning blonde woman who had been married to Geza de Kaplani for about 5 weeks. He was a physician and was sure that his new wife was having an affair or flirting with someone. He stripped her, tied her to the bed, and mutilated her with knives. He then poured sulfuric and nitric acid over her entire body. The neighbors called police after hearing her screams of agony. The first responders burned their hands trying to handle her body. The bed was pretty much disintegrated beneath her. Her genitals were obliterated from the acid. She lived for 36 days in a San Francisco hospital while her mother sat bedside praying for her quick death. I was 12 when that happened, and I'll never forget that one. Working in intensive care, I've seen my share of horrible deaths, but One that comes to mind was a patient suffering from pulmonary TB. He also had HIV. Guy, a convict currently serving 10 or so years for fraud and extortion, was referred to the hospital for difficulty breathing and persistent high fever. Had to intubate him less than 24 hours into his ICU admission, had to insert a central venous line, and put him on pressors. His body slowly grinding to a halt. His kidneys failed next, his liver. He started bloating horribly and bleeding from any known orifice. At the end of his 20 days of stay, he was a blob. He barely looked human anymore. His was a very dehumanizing death, and he died alone. No relative ever checked up on him. Only the guys from the penitentiary came to pick his body up when he passed away. The image of what used to be that man will forever be etched in my mind. I saw a show years ago in which a guy driving a cab was just recording the stories his fares told him. He gave a ride to a cop who had just come off shift after working the scene of an accident where someone had gotten crushed by a train. The guy was still alive and lucid, but he was wedged between the platform and the train. And below the waist, he was just pulp, and there was no way to save him. They called his wife out so they could say their goodbyes, but ultimately they had to move the train, and as soon as they did, he was definitely going to die. There was no way around it. It was a pretty awful story, because while the death itself isn't gruesome, knowing that you have to do something that is definitely and immediately going to result in the death of another person is just horrific. Duncan McPherson, February 3rd, 1966 to August 9th, 1989. Duncan McPherson's body was found to have suffered significant trauma, including amputation of arms, hands, and legs. The damage is consistent with rotating machinery. His snowboard also had a uniform pattern of damage and was cut apart, which indicates that it too had gone through a machine. Lake's conclusion was that McPherson had a snowboard accident and injured his leg and was lying on the slope waiting for rescue. During that very foggy day, a snowcat driver did not see McPherson and ran him over by accident, killing him. Instead of reporting it, that driver, or his supervisor, buried McPherson and the shallow crevices. His body stayed hidden there for 14 years, until the glacier melted enough for it to be seen.